So we are very pleased to be joined tonight by three folks who bring a great deal, I think, of knowledge and experience and context to the film that you've just seen. And I'll introduce them now. To my left here, Rob Weiner is a longtime friend of Global Lens and Associate Humanities Librarian here at Texas Tech Libraries, specializing in film and popular culture. He is the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of more books than he would probably care to name on topics like film, comic book culture, and visual narrative more generally. And I've had the good fortune to work with him on a couple of those projects. We welcome him back tonight on short notice. We thank him for that. Next to him is Dr. Javier Gomez Alvarez Tostado, who is an assistant professor in the College of Architecture here at Texas Tech. His PhD he earned at Tulane University in historic preservation. And his expertise is in theory, criticism, and design, and is considered as one of the best teachers in the USA by Who's Who Editorial. He's a recipient of the Texas Tech Alumni Association Award as Best New Faculty. With an intense academic career, he's been teaching in 14 universities in the USA, Mexico, Spain, and England. He's a former advisor for Mexico City's mayor, with expertise in the city's historical center. Also as cultural advisor under President Miguel de la Madrid, hosted dignitaries and first ministers throughout Mexico City. We welcome him for Global Lens for the first of what we hope is several occasions. And then finally, another longtime friend of the series, Dr. Gary Elbow, who is Associate Vice Provost for Academic Affairs and also Professor of Geography and Honor Studies. Dr. Elbow is interested in human geography, Latin American regional geography, and geographic education, and also teaches a course on Latin American film here at Texas Tech. His most recent research involves transnationalism in Latin America. He recently co-edited an online collection of papers for the National Council for Geographic Education entitled Geographic Literacy in the United States, Challenges and Opportunities in the NCLB Era. Dr. Elbow was a recipient in 2003 of the Preston E. James Eminent Latin Americanist Career Award from the Conference of Latin Americanist Geographers, and in 2009 of the George J. Miller Award for Distinguished Service from the National Council for Geographic Education. So, once again, thank you, Dr. Elbow, for joining us. Our general format here is to allow each of the panelists to offer a few moments of remarks on the film, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. Rob, if you want to take it away first.
Well, what interested me about this film is the comparison with Ed Wood. Now, not having seen any of Juan's actual movies, I can't make that comparison, but I can talk a little bit about Ed Wood and the aesthetic of what one might call bad filmmaking. And I think that there is, especially if the portrayal in this film is correct, in terms of his sincere belief that he was a filmmaker, even though he made incompetent movies with bad editing, bad acting, whatever. But I think that only makes the film and a person's body of work, like Ed Wood's, who believed he was a sincere filmmaker. Maybe some of you have seen his movies like Plan 9 from Outer Space or Glen or Glenda, or have seen the Johnny Depp, Tim Burton film, Ed Wood, about his life. I think that there is sort of a beauty in bad filmmaking. It's different from, say, a movie that's terrible, like Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor, where that's an A movie, that's really just bad, as opposed to a movie that's incompetent but has a certain charm to it, if that makes any sense. And I think that that at least in the portrayal of Juan in this movie, that he really believed he was a sincere filmmaker. And Ed Wood did too. Now, Ed Wood, didn't really he did some pseudo sort of gangster movies. Most of his films were monster movies. He was a huge fan of Bela Lugosi, and in fact, Bela Lugosi acted in a number of his movies and actually died on the set of Plan 9 from Outer Space before they could continue filming. So the Bela Lugosi part was given to Ed Wood's wife's chiropractor, who was a lot taller, almost a foot taller than Lugosi himself. And so, I can't really say because I haven't seen any of Juan's movies in terms of stylistically if they're like Ed Wood, but that was enough to get me in the door. And when Dr. Peasley asked me to come, hang out at the panel almost an hour before the film, I was like, yeah, sure. I was planning on going anyway, and so that's the historical context I can kind of talk about. If you want to talk about bad movies, and we can discuss that a little later during the Q&A. But
well, that was an interesting movie in different aspects. I mean, because the movie somehow was trying to replicate the bad acting and the bad movies of the bad director as Juan Orol, and somehow became kind of like a churro, as we say in Mexico as well, but a beautiful churro, I would say, in which kind of like they're trying to represent a little bit of kind of the bad movies during a period in which kind of like was the golden movies era in Mexico. I mean, Indio Fernandez, which we saw it kind of portrayed on here, was a phenomenal kind of director and photographer. I mean, he made fantastic kind of movies, but also kind of always portraying kind of like the typical kind of characters from Mexico, the Charro and the Adelita and so on, and presenting Maria Felix and Lopez Tarso and things like that. Juan Orol was a horrible director and movie maker, but somehow kind of like he created a legacy, even though all his movies were about gangsters and about kind of like dancers, no? But during all the time, the criticism was really severe, as it was shown in the movies. I mean, that was completely a fact and truth. And I would say it was very severe with him because there were master movies happening at the same time. Kind of since 1931, when Santa was filmed, was kind of the first major movie that was done in Mexico, actually. Then kind of all are going to start following up, Maria Candelaria, Doña Bárbara, La Perla, Luis Buñuel, which is an extraordinary filmmaker, and I highly invite you to see his movies. Embedded in surrealism, but all his movies are just masterpieces. And phenomenal movie makers like Gabriel Figueroa, Alex Phillips, Rosalío Solano. So that was a very strong moment of movie making in Mexico, which was supported actually, and that's something interesting that we see on here, kind of like how they are portraying kind of different periods in history. Is very accurate in some way. I mean, that period, like the 1920s, 1930s, was the era after the revolution, in which kind of the military was pretty much kind of like the strongest kind of social strata in the society in Mexico. So pretty much kind of like everything was managed by the military. Those were the people with money, and those were the people that started kind of like supporting the culture in that time. So it was a movie full of surprises, this one that I saw. I mean, first time, and I would tell you the truth. I mean, we hear very little about Juan Orol because it was about director, but we start hearing a little bit more when truly the Cineteca burned. That was a fact. It really happened, and then the people start saying, well, all the movies from Juan Orol were lost. They're gone, even though they were the bad ones. But it's a treasure that is gone, together with many other movies, no. And thanks to that, a lot of people start kind of like trying to bring them back and finding here and there, whatever, copies, and they recover most of them. So, few other things that I'm very surprised that I like a lot is some old people from that era that still are alive and are kind of doing some things on this movie, like Tongolele. Tongolele was one of those rumba dancers from the 1950s. I mean, I'm surprised it's still alive. I mean, she must be like 130 years old at this time. I believe she's right there, no? Zamorita, the person of color as well that is on here. He also was an actor of been long time in movies and TV in Mexico for many, many years, no? So I was surprised to see him here, no? And then the funniest thing is kind of like listening Paquita la del Barrio singing the songs exactly as as Rosa Carmina, no, with the voice of Rosa Carmina. No? So like, what? Paquita la del barrio, like the one that's singing over there. It's a very popular kind of character right now in Mexico, no? A singer that sings all these dramatic kind of songs or whatever. So I think it worked out very, very well on there, no? But all these people were very famous. María Antonieta Pons, Ninon Sevilla, Emilio Lindo Fernandez, and Rosa Carmina. I mean, they were very well known in Mexico during the 50s and 60s. I wasn't there, but I can hear it from my grandma. No? And this is my grandpa's time. Mm-hmm. I really like that. My grandpa, actually, he was a journalist, but he brought the first movie theaters into Mexico together with Jorge Stahl. So they opened the first movie theater in Guadalajara, or the Green Room was the name of it. And like in Cinema Paradiso, he was the one who was doing all the effects behind the screen and everything. No? So it's interesting to see all these movies, no? Kind of like bringing a little more nostalgia about family issues there.
Well, let me make a little confession here, first of all, and that is my grandfather ran movie theaters back starting during the Depression and up through the 1960s. My father took over for him in probably about 1964 and then carried on. There were two theaters in this little town where I was raised. One of them was called the Coliseum and the other one was the Castle, and that's kind of how we do. They were dumps, but anyway. And they played grade B movies. So I was raised on these kinds of films in the U.S. and I can appreciate sort of what's going on, but I want to provide that context because remember, first of all, that this all happened before we had the boob tube. And so if you wanted to see visual entertainment, you had to go to the movies. And you could go to the movies where we had Saturday matinees for 20 cents. That's hard to imagine now. What's a movie cost? $20 out at the fancy new Palace of the Cinema at the mall. So people could afford to go. It was popular entertainment, and it didn't cost you an arm and a leg. And so, to keep that rolling, you had to have a whole bunch of cheap films, and that's the context in which Juan Orol and Ed Wood are making films. And that's the context in which they're able to make money on those films, because they were entertainment. And you didn't worry too much about whether the windows broke when the machine guns started firing. That wasn't a big deal. It was just something to do. It was a way to get out of the house. It was a cheap thrill. And during the Depression, there wasn't much alternative. And so that was the sort of thing that was going on. So that's how something like the films that are being satirized in this film managed to survive and managed to find a market. Now, let me say a few things about the film itself. It's full of all kinds of really interesting sorts of allusions that you'd only be aware of if you knew something about Mexican cinema or if you knew something about Mexican history. And that whole first section with the general is just a huge big satire on what was going on after the Mexican Revolution, kind of thing that you were talking about. And if you know something about what was happening in Mexico, that's just right on target, but in a satirical kind of sense. Ninon Sevilla, who was the one that Juan Orol never married, there's a reference. If you think back to the third Cuban woman, I think it was the third one, and there's a blonde who comes on first, and she walks off. She doesn't want to have anything to do with him, and her name is Ninon. And Ninon Sevilla was blonde. That's a stand-in for Ninon Sevilla, who became probably the most famous of the Grunderistas. So the film is meant to be, I think, a satire, but it's also meant to be, in a sense, a reproduction of the original Juan Orol films. You know, it's made in the style. And so, if you want to know what those films were like, you watch this one, and you can get a pretty good sense for what they. And I've never seen one either, but I'm guessing that that they were very much like the gangster films. It's a takeoff on the same kinds of films that were running in the United States, Cagney, and all those kinds of things that in the 30s and in the early 40s that were very popular. And some of which were excellent films, by the way. They weren't all grade Bs by any means. James Cagney was a very respected actor in the United States. And the rumba films came out of the tradition of the Caribbean and Cuba in particular. And you have to think, Cuba, we don't know much about Cuba anymore. I was showing a film the other night in my film class from Cuba. And I asked the class, all right, what do you know about Cuba? And, I got a big blank. Oh, well, let's see, it's a communist country, and I think it's an island, and, but nothing very sophisticated. So, in the 1930s and 40s, and especially in the 50s, when transportation became better and you could fly from Miami to Havana, Havana became the big playground. It was sort of the Sin City for people in the United States. And so there were cabarets where people like the women that Juan Orol was marrying and carting off to Mexico to be rumbista stars are a dime a dozen in Havana, because there are all these nightclubs and gambling joints that are set up to entertain people from the United States. So there's a connection between the U.S. and Cuba, and then carrying those women over, making the tropical movies, the rumbista movies, and making money on it.
I guess that was very fashionable all over in the United States, Mexico, and some part of Latin America. No? The whole idea of bringing salsa into Mexico started from there. I mean, but that time of the rumberas and that time of the 1940s, 1950s, I would say more like when all these things. And even I remember kind of like one of the main ones that actually immigrated to Mexico, Perez Prado, and he was the creator of Mambo, no? And
yeah.
And every single minute they were showing it on TV, with these big kind of like things here on the arms and just kind of shaking the body and all the rumberas dancing together, So that became a big popular tradition in Mexico, I guess, from the 1950s. Really influenced a lot. And still nowadays, I mean, there's plays that are very, very important, like Aventurera, which is somehow recalling again the idea of the rumbera from the 1950s.
Yeah, that's an Nino and Cedilla film.
Here you go. That's right. That's absolutely right. It's a very famous movie. Yeah.
Questions? Comments? What did you think of the film? You laughed a lot. I could hear you all. Which is neat, because a lot of comedies don't translate very well. Comedy is the hardest thing to do with subtitles. But there's so much of this is visual comedy that you catch it immediately, and that's good. That's cross-cultural comedy.
Yeah, I think something that we need to be aware of is aesthetics. I think this kind of aesthetics that were kind of managed in all these movies from the 1950s is super important, and how to understand it, how the light was kind of handled in the studio. I mean, and the way the characters were like really stiff. I mean, they couldn't even move. I mean, when he was declaring his love at the very beginning of the movie, I mean, it was a laughable kind of like scene, no? But that was the truth. I mean, that was the way of making movies, and that was what people were expecting to see. They were really felt like very intense love when they see this guy almost not looking at his lover, no, like, and declaring love at that moment, no. So I guess even kind of like when we see soap operas nowadays, Mexican soap operas, we can find a link to all these kind of like movie making from the 1950s, no? All the drama that is accumulated over there is absolutely surreal.
Was this opening scene actually from one of the movies that you made?
I don't think so, because but I mean, to tell you the truth, I mean, I don't recall even seeing the movies from Juan Orol. I may have seen them like just by the chance in Channel 4 in TV when I was a kid, because they used to kind of show all these movies and by a chance. But as I was telling you, we were more interested in those ones that were the hits, the big hits. And particularly there was this guy, I mean, there was a Spanish guy as well. That's another fact as well. That's another very important thing. In 1930s and 1940s, there was a huge immigration of Spanish in Mexico, which they later on became kind of really, really top intellectuals, top kind of like in the industry. I mean, when we listened to this company of bread that is named Bimbo, that was one of those Spanish that immigrated to Mexico. So there were a lot of kind of like talented Spanish that moved to Mexico at that precise time. So I really don't recall. I don't know if it is or it is not really.
I want to challenge the Ed Wood comparison because leaning toward Roger Corman. Corman was the king of the bees here, and he made terrible movies too, but not at the level of Ed Wood.
No.
But they made money, and so it seems like it's more of a Corman thing. And the last thing I wanted to ask you about was talk about comedy not quite translating. I didn't understand the what ass.
Yes.
Well, let me tell you that. I can tell you that. Usually, kind of like the lower class in Spain, they say that word all the time, coño, no, and they translate it into badass, but really means something stronger than that. But I guess that was kind of like somehow smoothed down in the translation. But that's very popular, kind of like in the countryside in Spain, like coño, and they always say coño for everything. No, but I think here they just exaggerated on that a little bit.
It's not like a comment on someone.
It's just it's just like a criticism to the Spanish people from that time. Kind of like they are representing a Spanish that was a low class Spanish that came to Mexico and he somehow succeeded, even though he did one terrible movies. But and then that was another thing that happened. All these Spanish that went to Mexico in the 1930s and they succeeded. I mean, they really made money and whatever. They came back to their country, and the very first thing was that they brought back like an American car. Usually they brought like a Chrysler or like a big car. And in Spain, I mean, they were just tiny little cars. The big surprise was the big kind of waiting was not to see the person coming back, but was to see the car and arriving. Like, you see, kind of like Juan just brought this beautiful car. I mean, he's so successful. We got a Chrysler, So that was very popular. I mean, that was always known. That is part of that culture between Spain and Mexico.
I think your comparison to Roger Corman is fantastic because Corman was so prolific, and Juan was prolific. Yeah, and he's called the King of the Bees. And although he did actually make some really good films, some of those Vincent Price ones, were really good. And he fostered great filmmakers like Peter Bogdanovich and others. But I think that it didn't occur to me, but that makes a whole lot of sense. One of the things in terms of the movies that I've seen that could be comparable are some of the monster movies from Mexico in the 1950s and 60s, like The Brainiac or The Robot versus the Aztec Mummy. Or I'm also a huge fan of the Santo films and the Lucha Libre wrestler movies, and they're terrible, but they're really fun to watch. Where he fights, vampire women or Dracula or regular gangsters. So
they're super cheesy.
Yeah, very cheesy, but they're fun.
They're so cheesy and so bad that they make you laugh. There's no other way around.
I love Santo and the Blue Demon.
The Blue Demon, yes.
Yeah.
The masked guy. And even the well-known movies at that time, I mean, the top ones, the ones that are considered like the very, very top, like Maria Candelaria, as like the masterpiece of movie making of the golden era of the movies in Mexico. I mean, if you see the drama, I mean, it's also laughable. Kind of like, I mean, the script is absolutely funny. I mean, it's also kind of very, very tight and very It's like the guy declaring the love to the woman. No? It's kind of like more like that. No? But the people love that, and they really, really wanted to see those kind of movies. No? They cry with the movie. I mean, there was, even though now we see it completely unnatural.
Well, I think that's the aesthetic, though, and that there one can find beauty in that aesthetic because it is so strange or laughable or so wooden, because there's a seriousness underneath it, which is why filmmakers who try to sort of reinvent bad movie making, like Larry Blaine and others that sort of do B movies with that intent, they don't work as well today as seeing a movie from the 1930s or 50s or 60s that has that kind of aesthetic.
Although Luis Buñuel, as I was recalling at the beginning, is completely different. I mean, he's embedded in surrealism. He worked at the very beginning with Salvador Dali, Le Chien Andalou, and then he moved into that direction. So those are movies for thinking.
They are
absolutely amazing. They use the same aesthetics than all this golden movie era in Mexico, but the scripts of Luis Buñuel movies are absolutely phenomenal. I mean, those are movies for thinking. Those are for people that really like kind of art movies and cult movies.
I think one other thing that we need to bear in mind is that acting styles change over time. And if you went back and looked at early John Wayne movies, or even maybe late John Wayne movies, that style of acting, John Wayne was John Wayne in every movie he ever made.
Yeah.
So you knew what you were going to see. He's playing a different role, but it's still the same thing. He's not really in character, and that's changed now. We won't accept that anymore. But back in the day, that was very common, and the same thing is true of Mexican films, I think, or anybody else's films. That what was acceptable in the 30s, in the 40s, is no longer acceptable. And one of the tip-offs to this is when I just knew I was going to talk about this film, I went and looked at the list of 100 best films made in Mexico, which is a little old now. It probably would be changing a lot with newer Mexican films. But the point is that Juan Orol's was it Gangsters and Charros turns up to be number 68 on that list. The only one he's got, but it's on the list of 100 best Mexican films. And now, there are a lot fewer Mexican films, but still, to be on the 100 best list is not a bad deal. And Emilio Fernandez has got dozens on that list, the other big directors. But the point is, he did make it with one film. And so, there's some aesthetic quality, even though they're pretty corny
and also as part of Mexican culture, I guess. I mean, because we talk a lot about the golden era of movies in Mexico, which I think the major kind of achievement was the aesthetics. I mean, the photographers and the directors were phenomenal at that time. Alex Phillips was fantastic, and Gabriel Figueroa as photographer was top, number one. So the aesthetics was the main thing, not the drama, but the aesthetics itself of how making a movie. Then after that, in the 1960s, 1970s, the movies in Mexico just became so crappy, they were absolutely horrendous. I mean, we were kind of like considering Juan Orol as a bad movie maker. 1970s was the worst. I mean, the worst movie making ever. And I guess that, again, kind of like the making of good movies began in the 1980s. Actually, I would say that 1989 exactly, with one movie that is named Rojo Amanecer, Red Dawn, by Jorge Fons, about Tlatelolco. And they took seriously, again, kind of like the good movie making. And nowadays, again, it's in a very nice period, a golden era now with people like Guillermo del Toro and González Iñárritu. I mean, they're doing excellent movies, no? I mean, from Amores Perros and Y Con Tu Mamá También, and things like that. Fantastic movies. And there's a new director now in Mexico that is hardcore. I mean, it's just adult-oriented kind of director, but I highly suggest you to look at as well. His name is Carlos Regadas. He's a young talent. I mean, he's doing phenomenal movies. One of those that I really like a lot is named Batalla en el Cielo. It's Battle in Heaven from 2005. Fantastic. Well, now the drama is what really matters, not not just the aesthetics.
One of the problems with Mexican film is it's hard to fund them. And so you find people like Del Toro and González Iñárritu and Cuarón who have left Mexico and they're making films in Spain or in the United States or elsewhere where they can get them funded. So Mexico becomes sort of a breeding ground for good directors who then move on.
There was a formula, actually, when they created Conaculta, an institute of cinema. First of all, every single kind of complex of movie theaters, they're going to be showing all the time one Mexican movie, at least, among all the Hollywood movies. And the second thing is that a percentage of all whatever they earn, kind of like making or showing kind of like movies, international movies, is going to be applied in making Mexican movies. So I think that brought a little bit of money. But still we see kind of low budget. And when they're kind of like really interesting directors, they get opportunities here in Hollywood or in Spain as well, like Dr. was talking about. But it's a good moment. I think it's a good moment for making movies.
Filmmaking in the United States has always been very heavily privatized. No government involvement, really. A little bit during World War II for propaganda films, but basically not very much. And Latin America, Mexico, and Brazil, and Argentina have usually had a lot of government investment in film production. And as the government fortunes or the politics go in one direction, you've got a lot of money poured into film. And as it goes in the other direction, the money comes out, and film production suffers and changes. And, so it's a different formula for creating a cinema industry and for keeping it going.
So I don't know if there's questions.
I have a question about the Mexican film industry. We've had films from Mexico in the series before. One year we were lucky enough to have one of the actresses from one of the films, whose name escapes me at the moment. The name of the film was what was it? Bao. Thank you. Anyway, she was here and she talked about how they, she and the director and the producers were really nervous about whether their film would have any audience in Mexico because of the sort of overwhelming presence of predominantly American film. Do you think a film like this will have an audience in Mexico, or is this a film that's made for a festival, international festival?
Well, people like it. People like art movies in Mexico a lot.
Yeah.
So yes, they have audience, definitely. And they discuss about it. No? I mean, that's, for now, everybody's just expecting to see another Guillermo del Toro or another kind of Iñárritu popping out with an interesting movie. Whenever there's a new production in the theaters, the people go to see it. And they may say, it's not that good. No? Or it's like, it's okay, but it's not that great, and it's trying, whatever. But suddenly, they come out with really interesting movies.
I think another thing about movies in Mexico, and you can challenge me on this if you want to, but it seems to me that because television is so powerful, what happens is that the people who go to films tend to be upper middle and upper class, and they're people who would be interested in art films, and a film that would, like this one, this would be a really fun film for somebody who's steeped in Mexican history and culture and the history of the film industry, because it's just really rich with content.
Yeah, it's very nostalgic and shows a lot of historical facts from here. Maximino Avila Camacho, which was a gambler, like the president's brother, and they talk about Miguel Alemán that came afterwards. There's moments, like example, the beginning when they pull out that coffin from a modern building in the 1920s. I think like, wow, that's exciting. It was a moment when they tried to bring also architecture, very contemporary or modern, I would say contemporary, modern architecture in context in Mexico, and people like Juan Orol start building, and Legarreta start building interesting kind of like modernism. So there's moments in which if you are knowledgeable, you will enjoy it. You say like, wow, this guy was really getting the point that it was not just about historical architecture by talking 1920s, but it was also about modernism at that time. And And those little moments are enjoyable, really enjoyable. So I like when there's a lot of research. Unfortunately, we can see that there's low budget here, and they repeated The Office like 3 times maybe. Kind of like his office was working was exactly the same office as the American producer over there and everything. So and then the cabinets were like not accurate with time, and the lamp over there was a IKEA lamp, I guess, or something like that. So you could see little moments of inaccuracies because of low budget. But the intentions were very good. I think the customs that they wore there, they were very accurate. And I really like the script. Somehow the way they spoke the Spanish, it was very much 1950s. At the very beginning, when she started kind of like saying a narrative over there, I mean, I just can imagine my grandpa saying that, exactly with the same kind of like blah blah blah. No? I mean, they were very flamboyant in the way they used to speak.
You were saying that they said that same sense before. I love that it was shot like that because it felt so much like a B movie from that time, with everything was just over the top. He walks into the cinema and there's an old woman crying over the coffin. It was just great and over the top. But I didn't feel that he was the Mexican Ed Wood because it felt to me like his movies were making money, but they were just terrible. And I didn't feel that until he goes to Spain and they're saying, we got all our movies here, even Cantinflas. And he's going, the level of Cantinflas, and you think you're this good that we're still doing your movies. It just felt so great to me.
Yeah, Cantinflas, for those ones who don't know, is kind of a comedian, a very famous comedian in Mexico from those times. And still they're showing many of his movies all over the place. And it was really top on the list.
A comment on the dubbing. That was during the Franco regime. And they were dubbed because they wanted to censor the content. It wasn't the Spanish so much as it was the content that they were worried about. And they didn't. It was a very, very rigidly Catholic regime, very conservative, a dictatorship, and very, very heavily controlled media. And that didn't end until 1975 when Franco died and the monarchy was reestablished.
Well, and what you pointed out, Ed Wood's movies really didn't make money that much, whereas Corman's, I mean, he wrote the book, how I made, 100 movies and never lost a dime or something like that, on the cheap. So you did get the impression that they did make, at least a small profit, if not a big profit on some of them. So
Just the musical numbers would be worth, setting for the...
yeah.
That was something interesting because in most of these movies, when they were kind of like having rumberas, they spend a lot of money on sets for the dancers and the whole choreography. I mean, I think most of the production used to go there, and the beautiful outfits and everything for the dancers and the orchestra and everything in Acapulco. Because Acapulco was a very nice set for these kind of rumbera movies, and a lot of money was put on there.
It reminds me of the India cinema where you have a lot of breaks for musical numbers, and it seems like the gangster stuff is just sort of a prop for the musical.
You mean like Bollywood movies?
Yeah.
Oh, I love them.
And they were really quirky as well, very tacky, but with this showing kind of the culture of that time, I mean, and cabarets were like that. I mean, like they...
It seems more to me like his movies were just like exploitation films of I need to get this dancing or gangster into my movie, and everything else is just peripheral. Because I can just work around it. He doesn't take the glass out in one shot, saying they don't come for shooting glass. They come for my dancing or the
Exactly.
gangster. So it's just like an exploitation film.
Yeah, and seeing this beautiful dancer as well. They have gorgeous bodies. I mean, all these dancers. I mean, Tongolela, even at her 130 years he's got, he must have a beautiful body. And they show them. So, of course, I mean, that was very popular. I mean, everybody wanted to see those movies at that time. These girls dancing and moving all her body like that, and the drums and everything like in the jungle or something like that. And it's like...
Those were the days when women wore one-piece bathing suits.
Yeah.
So those costumes, which we laugh at, were actually rather daring for the day.
There's another moment that I was interested as well when they filmed the killing of that guy. He was representing a Cristero. Cristero is these groups that during the period of Calles, President Calles, he decided that he will close all the churches in the country. So there was no kind of like religion allowed, and the people start complaining, and they start kind of like making strikes and having kind of underground church. And among those groups that were kind of like striking about it were the group of Cristeros. So it represents one of these Cristeros killed by one of the military from Calles. So there's a lot of little historical facts in the movie that make it interesting. Catch up.
Is
nicely.
Don Guillermo a real historical figure?
Well, that's the one that I don't know. I really don't know. As it's just named Don Guillermo. I mean, I tried to kind of like figure out, and I even pulled out my phone and started kind of Googling in it to see if I could find something, but I have no clue. The other ones, yes. When he said Ninon, that's Ninon Sevilla, como like right away, no? Catch it up. Or Rosa Carmín, or María Antonieta Pons. No? They were very famous. Those were very, very famous names. But Guillermo, no clue. Maybe that's a fiction.
I've got a feeling that's an invented character.
Yeah.
But the implication is that there was U.S. involvement in film, and I don't know if there really was in Mexican film. There was a lot of interaction between the Mexican and the American film industry, a lot of exchange of actors, especially Mexican actors coming north and then going back south again. But there was certainly heavy American involvement in Mexico up until the Revolution. And then after the Revolution, it got to be very, very difficult for Americans to invest in Mexico. And so I'm guessing that was just kind of a put on. And it was, I think in contemporary Mexico, putting an American into that role probably resonates a little bit now in the days of NAFTA and all that kind of stuff, NAFTA is not very popular in Mexico.
Mm-hmm. But the funny thing is that many of the actors or actresses, they want to come to the U.S. to succeed here, no? And they're doing it. I mean, some of them, they're really, like Salma Hayek. No? Mm-hmm. She started doing a movie, a very interesting movie actually in Mexico. What is the name of it? I don't recall it, but 1980s.
Milagros.
Callejón de los Milagros. Yeah. That was the name of it. Like the Miracle Alley. That was her first movie down there, and that was like put attention on the movie makers here in Hollywood, and they brought her here, no? And then she's been doing great here. And same happened with Guillermo el Toro and Iñárritu, no? I mean, they were very famous in Mexico already. Iñárritu was doing a lot of musical spots and videos. And they were very famous in the 1990s, I would say, early 1990s. And that called attention by people, and they brought him in. Well, of course, kind of these major movies that happened, with Amores Perros and with Tu Mamá También, were triggers for bringing them here. So still is a big dream from many of the actors, actresses, and directors in Mexico to do a good movie there, to be attracted by Hollywood. Because here's where the big budget is, what they say. And now we have two guys, Gabriel García Bernal y this other guy, Diego Luna, which also are doing great here in the U.S. as well.
That Salma Hayek film was very depressing.
Well, I like Frida, because somehow kind of like in Frida, they show the real stages, kind of like whatever they use as the scenarios are fact, are real. That was Frida Kahlo's house and Diego Rivera's place as well.
The original Frida, the 87 Frida was a better film.
I guess so. Yes, maybe that's the one I'm talking about.
That didn't have
I know which one. Yeah, that one is more. It was a Mexican movie that was kind of like more about portraying kind of the artwork of Frida, right?
Yeah,
And the character, yeah.
Focused a lot more on her relationship with Diego Rivera.
Yeah. Who was always terrible.
Other questions?
I just have a comment, and this might just be me, but I thought it was interesting after hearing so much about machoism and you know, and he might be in control in the movies and such, but once she starts dancing in real life, he just kind of loses function of his body. You know, the women are always taller than him, and he's kind of, I thought it was interesting that he never really, breaks up with them. It's always them breaking up with him. You know, she says something about too much of a woman to be with him. So I thought that was interesting, kind of undermining. I thought it would be different.
Well, the playoff with the alter ego is the macho.
And you're touching a very interesting point, actually. In the very beginning as well, they're talking about the female character, about the woman, as the humble lady that is always behind her husband. So that was fact. That was real. Somehow, kind of like women were meant to support their husbands, and they should always be sort of like behind it in a certain way, So feminism started much later. They gotta be married and be there behind their husband, supporting them and helping him to achieve his goals all the time. Abnegada is the word. A woman should be an abnegated woman behind her husband. So that was a very interesting point, the one that you just put out, the role of women in the 1950s.
My impression, if I understood what your point is that in Latin America there are a lot fewer actors to go around, and so crossing back and forth from one medium to another is very common. If you look at the filmography of Latin American actors, there's probably more television than film, but they're back and forth all the time. And
famous on television. American Tom Cruise.
That's right.
They do strictly films and they get paid $30 million a film. I don't know, so that's the difference.
Yeah, and I think there's a little bit of a pecking order in the United States in the sense that cinema is more respected than television.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good point too. I think in Mexico as well, actors and actresses, they see as being performers on TV and movies and in theater as well to be very good, kind of like professionals on acting. So they gain reputation by performing in different media.
But it's changing too. I mean, George Clooney, he started out as a television actor, and now he's probably the biggest, one of the biggest box office stars now. I mean, we didn't see the guy from Breaking Bad he was in Argo. There's something.
Well, and the rise of pay cable television programming, quality TV has made. I mean, HBO. I mean, what's the one that's coming out next month on HBO? Al Pacino, Helen Mirren, are playing Phil Spector, and whatever his wife.
Yeah, Dustin Hoffman was in a HBO series too. So I think that up until probably the early 1990s, you're right. There was just a movie actor that came on to television was considered like a step down. But I think that in the current sort of converged media situation, at least contemporary audiences don't make that much distinction between the cinema and
Yeah, I suspect you're right.
Any other final comments from the panel or questions?
I like the attempt of the silent movie at the beginning.
Well, and actually the aesthetics kind of,
Yeah.
you can sort of see from the silent film to sort of that 30s and 40s, the backlit femme fatale aesthetic. When we're in the 60s, you get that kind of grainy, Technicolor feel in the film as well. It's pretty clever.
Yeah, it was very clever.
Telling the story, especially given that this is his first film.
Yeah.
Pretty ambitious.
Well, it's a good film, but it's a little bit of an insider's film.
Yeah.
In the way that we've been talking about it.
Yeah, I guess that for the people that kind of understand the Mexican culture and the history of Mexico, it's enjoyable because you start catching up those moments of history and bringing relationships now there. For other people, I mean, that are not really that familiar into Mexican culture, I think it's a bit hard to see in certain moments. I don't know if somebody had a little bit hard time in kind of like following up. Maybe because of the aesthetics, no? I mean, that made it interesting.
It was enjoyable even not knowing all of the history.
Mm-hmm.
It was still funny and still entertaining and very well done.
Uh-huh.
And you just, I guess just being as close as we are to Mexico, you think, oh, I remember that might have been historically accurate. Not knowing the exact things, but knowing just enough. It was totally.
Because, I mean, the main drama is just representing the bad movies from Juan Orol, no? I mean, the way he used to make them. So it's not really the main point of the movie. I think the main point of the movie is just to catch up, no? The different historical elements and the fashion of the time and how they used to make the movies and how the people perform at that time. I think that's what it makes it interesting.
I felt it was just so fun to watch. I know very little about Mexican cinema and history, and the only thing that I recognize some like actors that my grandparents would tell me about, like Cantinflas all the time.
Mm-hmm. Have you watched his movies?
When I was little, my grandparents would have, I don't know, they had VHS copies of his movies. I don't know how they got them,
Wow.
but they used to show me a bunch of Cantinflas movies when I was little, and all I remember is just the mustache.
There's another comedian that we also forget sometimes from that time. This is a Spanish comedian, actually, that moved to Mexico and started making a lot of movies in Mexico. And he became very famous in Mexico as well. And you gotta watch them, they're fantastic. His name is Pardavé. And he made phenomenal movies exactly at that time.
Cantinflas was in an American movie.
Yes, Around the World in 80 Days. Mm-hmm. And then the other popular ones, comedians as well, like Tintan, that also was nearby, kind of like the Rumberas, and it was the perfect kind of like character for Juan Orol's kind of movies. But he became very famous too. But I gotta see Pardavé. Pardavé is I remember my nanny, watching his movies all the time. I used to show them over and over again in Channel 4 TV, all the time. But they were awesome, beautiful movies. Joaquín Pardavé was his name.
Good.
Thank you.
So I think our panel
Thank
deserve
you.
a round of applause.